Hello and welcome to the second video of our PHP Framework building series. In this series, we will start with building our dependency injection scanning mainly, and also start to build the attributes we will need for scanning our services. So let's start. We'll start with adding a new package. We'll call it attribute. And there will be our main attributes in located. So the first attribute we will build, it's a PHP class we'll call service. This can be a read-only class. And this one will have an attribute. So attributes in PHP, to define them, will have the attribute, which is a bit redundant, but needed. And we'll give it a config attributes target class. This means that we can only declare this attribute on class level. We will have one public variable, which can be a string or a null, and it's the name. So our we'll need to change our PHP level as well. Let's put it at 8.3 because that's the PHP version we're using. And then okay. So in the service attributes, our name can be null. And then we'll just use the full class name, which means the namespace and the class name. But we can also give it a specific name, and then we'll use that specific name to perform the injection, which is important for our qualifier attribute. So we'll generate our construction with a name. It can be string or null, and we'll give it a default value null, so we don't have to fill it in if needed. That's our first attribute. Then we have another attribute called property, which is the same as service. So we'll copy paste the class and we'll call it property, which also has a name, but here it can be null. So here the name is required. So we'll change that everywhere. And property is a special annotation. It's also not on the class, but it's on the parameter. So when we inject things into our service, we want to have the ability to inject a property from a YAML file, for example. And the name is a dot separated string that then links to the YAML file. And that way we can inject things that we have in our config folder, depending on the profile, into services. So it's mainly for configuration properties, but it's on a constructor level, on constructor parameter level. That's why we put target parameter. What else do we have? We have a attribute. Let's just create a new class. It's called qualifier. So let's say we have a service and we implement the service into two different services, but it has the same interface, and we use that interface to define the class type. That means that we need to have a qualifier with a name to say, oh yeah, I really want this service to be injected and not the other one, because otherwise our dependency injection framework will have two possibilities to inject and will not know what to inject and it will crash. That's why you can use the qualifier with a name to really say, yeah, okay, I want to do, I want to inject this service into here. And it's also an attribute. It's a hashtag, not an add. That's Java. And what do we want to inject? Well, we say it's attribute colon and it's also on the type parameter. Need to import it. And it's the same as in service. It needs to get the name of that service we want to inject. So it's really, this is my qualifier to inject it. Inject this one instead of the other one. That's what it says. In the same thought category, we will also have a primary attribute. We also need to put read only on every part because it is read only. So our qualifier needs to be read only. This attribute will be a class attribute. So we'll put attribute target class with nothing else. That's it. But what it will do is say, okay, if I have an interface service and service 1 implements service and service 2 implements service, but on service 2 we have the primary attribute, then our dependency injection framework will know, okay, inject service 2 instead of service 1 because that's the primary one. That's good if there is no qualifier or so specified, then the framework still knows, okay, I need to choose this one over that other one. If it has 3 services and 2 services have the primary, it will still crash. But if only one has the primary, we can just continue. So that's on the user end to configure it well, but it's a helper attribute to say this is my primary service and that's when I want to use it. And those are the attributes we will use. So we have service, which expects a name but can also be null. We have a property, which expects a name, which will represent the YAML path. We have a qualifier, which also I see now that we have put null, but it needs a name no matter what. Otherwise, a qualifier wouldn't make sense. And then we have a primary, which is a completely empty. We'll just put hashtag primary just to say this is my primary service. So we can use these services in our example usage later on to really start, injecting services into each other and have properties and stuff. So next up, we'll start to create a scanner for our dependency injection because we need to scan our class paths that we want. So let's create a class. I will call it service scanner. And we will need a few things. So we'll need a private array called PSR for mappings. And these mappings we'll get from Composer, and it maps namespaces to directories. So to scan PHP files, we need the directories, but we want to pass in namespaces. So we'll need the mappings between the namespace and directories. It will become clear once we continue more of our code. We'll also need then a private array base namespaces, which will be a array of strings. So we'll annotate it with @var string, and we'll need the constructor for it. So why do we need the base namespaces? Because we can just check everything. It's mainly, even if we are going to cache our service dependency container, so the scan doesn't need to happen every request, we still want to limit the time, the first time that it needs to scan. So if we give in specific base namespaces we want to scan, we can limit the amount of files we want to scan. If you don't give in a namespace, we should check every PHP file in our project and in our framework, but with the base namespaces, we can limit it to what we really need. So it's mainly a performance gain. So as a constructor, we just map PSR4 mappings and namespaces to their variables, and we'll have one public function called scan. A scan will return array, but what array will we return? We will return a service injection info array. And maybe it's now a good time to really start creating our service injection info. First things first, let's create a new folder called scanner, and let's put service scanner in there. You will see that the namespace also changed to use this scanner. So inside scanner, we'll create as well a new package, and we'll call it model. And in model, we'll create a new PHP class, service injection info. So that's what we will return an array of. Let's import the class. So what will the service injection info contain? First of all, it will be a read-only class, so everything will be initialized by the constructor. So it will have a private reflection class. It will have a private string injection name. So it will be the class name with the namespace unless the name is specified in the attribute. We'll have a private string service attribute class name. So in the future, we will have, for example, an attribute controller, which extends service. But for our routing, we will want to have every controller service attribute classes. And that's why we as well save it in here, so we can quickly have it without scanning everything again. That's why we cache it in this variable. We'll have a private bool primary. So is this one, does it have an annotation primary? And we'll have a private array of constructor injection arguments, which is an array of, which that's a class we need to create, constructor injection arg. And that's it. Let's create that class already, and we'll fill it in later on. Then what we can do is generate a constructor, and we want everything to be injected. And for every value, we want a getter as well. And that's it for our service injection info class. We of course now have our constructor argument. But before we can use our constructor injection argument class, we need to as well have a enum. So let's select enum here. And we'll call it constructor injection type. And this enum will extend string because it's a string. We'll call it case. And we'll have a bean, which is just a normal service to inject. So all our services are beans, but we'll also have a property. And property is with the attribute here, property. It means that we inject something from our config files and not another service that's defined. So the dependencies are different. Because properties are loaded in at the beginning, we can just inject them. And beans need to be instantiated. And if it has dependency on a bean, it means that, yeah, we need to instantiate that bean before the other service. That's why we have those different types. That's it for this enum. So our constructor injection arg has three properties. It's private reflection parameter. Let's call it just parameter. Let's import it. We'll have a construction injector type. Let's call it type. And do we have a qualifier or not? So it's a string null qualifier. So do we have a qualifier or not? We again can generate a constructor for those three types, and let's generate the getters as well. No setters needed, and because we do not have any setters, we can say that this is a read-only class. Then we have PHP hammer that says, let's replace this one with a long name. Okay. So that's our construction arguments, and our service injection info will have multiple of those. To make our lives easier, let's create as well builders for those two models. So let's create a new package called builder. Let's say new class, and we'll call it constructor injection arg builder. So we need to first define every property again. So we have a reflection parameter. We have a type, which is constructor injection type. And we'll have our string or null, which is our qualifier. And we initialize it in the beginning with null. Then we have a function with parameter. I think subset reflection parameter, which returns this class, so the builder itself. So we can say return this. And here we have parameter. So this parameter equals parameter. And that's how we will use our builder. Let's copy paste this one and say with type, which is a construction injection type. Call our variable as well type. And we say type equals type. Then we have with qualifier. So it's string or null. We say qualifier, and then qualifier equals qualifier. And of course, we have a public function build, which will return the constructor injection argument. We say return no construction argument. We will return parameter, we will return type and the qualifier. That's our builder for this class. And that makes it easier to use in our scanner. And of course, for our service injection info, we'll also need a builder. So service injection info builder. Let's create it. This one has a bit more properties. So first things first, private reflection class, and let's import it. We'll call it class. We have a property that's a string called injection name. We have a string called service attribute class name. We have a private bool primary. We'll initialize this one to false. And we have a private array called constructor args, which is an empty array to begin with, but this array accepts constructor injection arguments. So first thing first, we'll say public function with class, which accepts a reflection class. It returns self. So this class equals class, same as the other class, and we return ourself. So we can just chain it when we're using it, which will be quite clear when we want to use it. With next function is with injection name string injection name. Let's assign it. That's it. Third one with service attribute class name is also a string. Service attribute. Class name. Let's assign it. There is no logic here, which just needed so we have a easy builder. We have with primary. So that's a bool. And again, say this primary equals primary. We have with constructor args. Then we have an array constructor args. And we again assign it. And let's put a PHP doc in this one. So IntelliJ nodes, it's an array of constructor arguments. And then, of course, we say public function build, which will be a service injection info. Say return no service injection info. We return the class, our injection name, our service attribute class name, if it's primary or not, and our constructor arguments. And then we have nice builders to work with in our service scanner. Okay. Back to our service scanner. So in our scan happens the magic of scanning everything. First things first, we need to find all our classes we need to scan. So scanned classes. And it will be an array. And we'll fill this array with a for each with our base name namespaces as namespace. So we'll loop over every namespace that we given in. And we'll say scan classes equals array merge. So we'll merge it every time we loop over it. We say we want to merge scan classes, which is containing everything with this scan namespace. So we will find all classes in our namespace. Let's create the scan namespace method. It will return an array. And this array, it will be reflection class array. So let's import it. So how will the namespace work? So you see we receive a specific namespace and we say, okay, scanned classes is again an empty array. And we say for each again. with a new function, this find starting directories. I will pause in namespace. And it's S directory. So what does this do? It checks our PSR4 mappings to find the directories where we need to scan into. To make it more clear, let's implement it directly. So again, it returns an array, that's why it's for each, but it's a array that's a string. It will just return an array of directories. So what do we need to implement in here is we will need to check our namespace and our PSR4 mappings. Now, exactly what are PSR4 mappings? So a composer has a file that's outload underscore PSR4. And inside this file, you can see our namespace that maps to an array of this folder. But if we go, for example, in our example usage, the PSR4 outload PSR4 is a bit different. So you see web maps to PHP-Boot web source. PHP-Boot HTTP maps to PHP-Boot HTTP source. PHP-Boot DI maps to PHP-Boot DI source, etc. Up maps to source. And that's what we can use to narrow down our folders we need to scan. So we'll find the mapping, and in the mapping we will have the directories, and that's the starting directories. Once we have the starting directories in this function, we will find all the classes. But first we need to find the starting directories. And to find the starting directories, we need as well an extra module under components, which is called utils. So let's create it. New module. It's PHP module under framework slash components. And we'll call it utils. I did it wrongly. Let's try it again. New module, framework. Let's select components and we'll call it utils. Create. And it's still not a utils create. Enable. Okay. Let's see if we can change this one in our project structure once we have implemented it correctly. From our example, let's take our web composer JSON. We can copy paste in everything. So we have PHP-Boot utils. It doesn't require anything but PHP. Our PSR4 namespace is utils. And we have a folder search. In our posters, we can say, okay, we need components later on. So we'll put in a star and let's create that source folder as well. Let's click install. Composer doesn't complain about anything, which is nice. Now let's go to our project structure. Let's import a module. Utils. Next, next, next. So now it's imported. We'll say this is a sources folder. PHP-Boot utils. And we, of course, exclude our composer folder. Okay. That's a good start. What do we need in our utils? We will need a new PHP class called string utils, which will be a read-only class. We'll create a private function construct. So we cannot instantiate this class. We'll create 3 methods in this one that we will use. So we'll create a public static function add trailing string. So we'll accept a string called value, which we will add it to, and we'll accept a string trailing, which will return a string. So this method is quite easy. It's an if statement. So we first check if the string already ends with our trailing string. If it does, then we say we'll just return our value. We don't need to add anything. Otherwise, we say we'll return our value with our trailing string. We can copy paste this one and we'll say add beginning string. We'll replace our variable here with beginning string. Of course, our ends with needs to be starts with. And we need to change it here that it says beginning string and then concatenate the value. Our last method in this class will be a public static function is blank, which accepts a string or a null. We'll call it scan value, and it's a bool. So then we just return if it's empty value. Let's see. Okay, we don't need it. So I just empty value. But that means that we can put in spaces. So we say we'll put in a trim as well. So it trims out all the spaces on the beginning and the end, and then checks if it's empty. So if that's the case, then it's an empty string. So now we can continue in our service scanner to finding the starting directories. So first things first, our namespace needs to be changed. The trailing string. So we'll put in our namespace and we'll say, okay, we want a backward slash at the end of our namespace if it's not there yet. Because if we go back and look at Composer PSR4, you can see it ends with a backslash. Here we can say if array key exists of our namespace with the PSR4 mappings, we just say we return the directories of our PSR4 mappings for that namespace. So that means if we put in PHP-Boot web, it will return that array over here. It's an easy one. It's a quick one to, again, gain some performance gain. Otherwise, we need to loop over it. So we say for each PSR4 mapping as key, then of course directories, because it has just directories. If string, if it doesn't start with our namespace, so if it doesn't match, then we just say, okay, let's skip this. It doesn't match, continue. Otherwise, we find our path for our directories to append, which will be string utils at beginning string. We will do a left trim of a right trim of the namespace. So first we will trim off our last backslash, and then we'll left trim our key off. So we have the folders, the directory structure that appends our namespace. And after that, we add our directory separator, depending on the system we are using. It's a forward slash or backward slash. So we append we add the directory separator at the beginning so we can append it to our map. After that, we say, okay, we return a mapped array. So we use the function array map, which has a static function with a directory with a dir. And then we say just dir appended with path to append, which will then be the specific path we want. That's our function. And what do we want to map? We say we want to map our directories. And I see I put array merge there. It needs to be array underscore map. In that way, we will have our map, well, our starting directories returned. If not, we will we'll say, okay, we didn't find any namespace that maps to our PS014, so we say throw new container container exception. And we'll say could not find any PSR4 mapping for namespace. Let's put it in small quotes. Namespace. Was there a typo? And the last thing we will do in this video is create this this exception. Let's create a new folder called exception. And in this folder, we'll create a new class called container exception. Maybe it's not the best name. Let's call it service scanner exception. Let's quickly as well rename it to this one. You can import it so it's correct. And this one will extend exception. And that's it. And then you can see that this one is already resolved. The only thing we really want to do is create an override. So let's override the toString. We will return class, append it with the following. We'll want the code. And of course, we'll want the message as well. So what this will return is the class. Then we say, okay, what's the code and what's the message? So we can debug it easily. And of course, we'll add our override attribute on these things. Okay. So next session, we will use this find starting directories to really scan every class. But what have we done this video? So we started creating a scanner, which will scan it to service injection info. And the service injection info has a reflection class, an injection name, a service attribute class name, if it's primary or not, and the construction arguments. It's all info we need to start doing dependency injection. What else do? We created our small string utils class, just some helper methods that PHP doesn't provide yet, but now we just use it. And we are finding our directories that we all need to scan. So that's the beauty of giving in our constructor of the scanner names base namespaces. It doesn't scan everything, but it will only scan those namespaces required to scan. So you can limit what directories and how many classes you need to scan, which will be a huge performance gain. Next video, we'll use those starting directories to really start scanning our classes and fill it into a service injection info array. I will print it out with var dump as well so we can see what the result is, which will be quite nice. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.